going to get started pretty quickly here because I'm excited to say, three awesome storytelling trainers who come from very different backgrounds, but with shared experience in storytelling. Today is a training session for storytelling. It's actually the only training session we're going to have. And then just to remind you guys of what comes next, we have 3 practice sessions where our 17 storytellers from 13 countries will be getting the opportunity to practice their storytelling. This is where I encourage you should all be attending to support the storytellers, help them to improve their storytelling, both with positive feedback and also constructive criticism, things that you think they can do better. And then on October, so that's 3 Sundays from now, and then October over the next 3 Sundays. And then October 9th and 16th are the final performances of these stories. And then we have a reflective session on October 23rd to get your feedback on everything. So I think with that said, if you have any, by the way, as we're going through this this training today, if you have any questions or if you have any comments, please definitely use the Zoom chat. You may also want to introduce yourselves in the Zoom chat currently, as particularly our storytellers, but everybody else is welcome to introduce yourself as well, because two of our storytellers have never met you before. Bethany has, I think, met some of you, but Lisette and Ben have not. So by all means, use the Zoom to introduce yourselves, ask questions as they go along, and offer any feedback or comments and so on as you go. Okay, with that said, let me introduce first Bethany, whom you might remember. She was part of part 1 of this FD training, which started July 10th. She focused along with her mom, they're both lecturers at Arizona State University, and helped us to get a better understanding of family life across the world. And so she's going to be presenting first, and then afterwards to provide some context. And then afterwards, we're going to hear from Ben and Lisette, who are, both of them come from different places professionally, but they're both experienced storytellers. So you'll hear from them second. So without further ado, Bethany.
Hello, I apologize. I'm in an empty room and I realized at the last minute it might sound pretty echoey. So sorry about that. Let me get to the sharing stuff. It's always tricky to balance the Zoom. Then I've got to see if I can see you all in chat. Okay. Are you all seeing the right thing? Not my notes? Okay, not that I'm using notes. And I want to make sure I can see if you're saying anything or if you raise your hands. So let me grab the chat. Keep introducing yourselves. It's really fun to see who's here. Especially, I think there's some new people that I haven't seen here before last time. Let me get my participants window. Okay. I think I've got everything on one screen now. Hello, I'm so excited to be here. I feel a little bit like the outsider because I'm not here to exactly tell you how to tell a great story. I know you've already started your stories and you're doing amazing things, but I'm here to sort of tell you the whys behind storytelling and the amazing things that we can do with storytelling, and the place it plays in our personal lives, but also then how that can expand to doing amazing things. So I've already been introduced. That's me. I'm Bethany. I study family. I write about family. I teach about family. I teach parenting. I teach human development, all that kind of stuff. So I'm on the academic side of studying family, but I also have a family. And so I feel sort of a lot like many of you diplomats who are getting trained out there. And I've really enjoyed being sort of a part of this as I learn how to make change and to work for policy changes and communicate the needs of families. So I really love what you all are doing. Thank you for letting me be a small part of it. Okay, so take a moment. Here are some questions. Just think to yourselves if you know the answers to any of these questions. I'm going to ask a couple of people to share an answer, so be prepared, or ask you to volunteer, but just see what you know. Do you know how your parents or your grandparents met? Do you know where your parents grew up or where your grandparents grew up? Do you know any of the lessons your parents learned from good or bad experiences? I like this one. Do you know of a relative whose face froze in a grumpy position because they didn't smile enough? Okay. Does anybody have an answer they're willing to share for one of these questions? Raise your hand, unmute, chat. I'll try and catch you. Yes, Leroy.
Yes, I know where my parents met, and I also know where they grew up. My mom and dad met in Bon County, Liberia, one of the subdivision of the sub-political division of Liberia, in Bon County in Gallimore town. There where my mom and dad met, and where my parents grew up. My mom grew up in Nemba County, one of the political subdivision, while my dad grew up in Bon County, where they both met. And the next question that has to do with the source of my name. My name is an English name, and I was named after my mom's uncle. He is a rich guy because in our tradition, normally people name their children after rich people or somebody who is helping them. So at the time, the person was helping my mom and dad in their commercial farming. So they decided to name me after him. So my name Leroy was given after a rich guy or my uncle, my mom's uncle, who is a rich man. And the question I have to do with which person in your family you look or you at most like, okay, this question I normally look up to my mom and act like my mom because I grew up knowing only my mom. So based on this, I don't know more about my dad and I know more about my mom, and I exactly do what she, at least 95% of what she can do is exactly what I can do, because my mom can drink liquor, she can participate in most social activities. So that characteristics, I also have it. So I look up to my mom as well. Then
yeah, I'm gonna thank you. I'm
right.
gonna tell you what it means that you know the answers to so many of these.
Okay.
This is good stuff. But I see Tennille also has a hand up.
Yeah, thank you. So my parents met actually was a wrong number. My mom was supposed to call her friend, dialed the wrong number. My dad picked up. She loved his voice. And from that time, they just stayed in contact with each other. She was 16, he was 26, so it was still illegal. And they got married when she was 27. My grandparents met. My grandfather was a fireman. My grandmother was a receptionist. My other grandfather, they grew up. My grandmother is from St. Lucia, my grandfather is from Tobago, so they're from two different islands. My source of my name, my auntie Joanne named me after a husband and wife singing team called Captain and Tennille. And the relative with the frozen grumpy position would be my stepmother because she did not smile enough.
I've got someone else here who also said most of my family members don't smile enough. I love it. I love these stories. I love how your parents met. That's amazing. A wrong number and just the voice was enough. Thank you so much. I could spend, I think, hours listening to you all share answers to these stories, but you're probably wondering, or answers to these questions. You might be wondering why I'm even asking you these questions. I'm asking because actually 2 researchers asked these exact same questions with a few more. It was a total of 20 questions because they wanted to measure how much people knew about their families. And they decided these questions kind of captured some of those things that we might know about families and those family stories. And the reason why they wanted to study these questions was because they had a clinical practice and they started seeing that there might be something to knowing family history, to knowing family stories, and they wanted to see if that was true. And so let me tell you what they found. So what they did was they asked these questions, and the 20 questions, and they could give each people a score based on how many answers they knew to those questions. And they found that people who knew more answers to the questions had more emotional health and happiness. They had a greater sense of self-control and what we call an internal locus of control, which means you feel like you can control the world around you and what you need to control. You're not just blowing with the wind. They have higher self-esteem. The more questions they know, the higher self-esteem their participants had. Greater resilience, so they could push through hard things. They're better able to handle stress. People that knew more answers to these questions were more compassionate. They had a strong identity, or a stronger identity with the more questions they knew. Higher academic competence, that means they were doing better in school. Higher social competence. They were good at having friends. They were good at socially interacting with other people. Lower levels of anxiety came with knowing more answers to these questions. And fewer behavioral problems. And some of these were related to school. So that's a lot of good stuff that comes from knowing the answers to these questions. And more broadly, the research shows that the more we know about families and the more storytelling that we have in families, the more positive perception that people have of their family functioning. So they have a better idea. I've got a quote. Okay, why those exact questions, how they come up with these, how are the correlations made between those questions and the positive individual qualities? That's a great question. And I could go into like the analyses that they did, and I'm sure they controlled for certain aspects of things. And there's always a difficulty of cause and effect in research because this was not an experiment. And so that is definitely a place to talk about the details of the study. I'm happy to send you some of their articles if I can't write any notes on my computer when I'm all like this, but email me or chat at the end so I can remember and I can send you the specific article. But it is interesting. And I'm going to talk about the types of questions too, because it's not really about these specific questions, right? It looks like it's more than that. And I'll give you the name of the study. So someone remind me at the end. Okay, so people that do more storytelling and know more of this information, they have more positive perceptions of family, greater sense of family cohesiveness. So a greater sense of feeling like they're together, that they are a whole unit that works together in a positive way. And also more storytelling seems to be related to family healing and healthier families in that way. So I just went to a funeral for a family member on Saturday, and you can bet there was storytelling happening. There's sorrow and there's hard things, but then when we sat down together for lunch, there was primarily storytelling. And you could tell that was a healing process, and we were creating meaning out of this event, of this difficult thing. And so storytelling plays a role in that. Sorry. Okay, so strong and healthy families are marked by simple traditions and everyday rituals. And for some of you, we've talked about that before and the importance of those traditions and rituals. For example, one of the strongest correlates, again, this is a correlation, not causation, for children who do well in school is having dinner as a family at least 3 to 5 days a week. And there's a lot of reasons for this, but part of that could be related to what happens when you sit down to have dinner regularly together. So whether it's around the dinner table, or driving in the car, or getting together for family gatherings or outings, family stories are an important part of those things, and they're an important part of our rituals and our traditions. And that's where we're learning the answers to these kinds of questions that I've just asked you. We're not learning these answers in school, right? We're learning it through these daily interactions with our family members. Real quick in the chat, let me know, where do you tell family stories? Under what circumstances do you have the exchange of this kind of information? We've got the dinner table. What other times might you see these stories getting exchanged? Reunions, that's huge. And then you've got multi-generational stories, right? Road trips. I mean, that's a great place because you've got a captive audience. Holidays, family events. So we've got here some rituals and traditions that are combined with this. Phone calls, that's huge. Call grandma when you can call grandma. Whenever you're together. One of my tips at the end of this is just going to be having fun with people if you want to tell stories. Car rides to school. That's my kids were taking the bus and I noticed a difference in kind of that connection. I've got 4 minutes. So I'm going to hurry up. So what I love, I'm going to give you this quote really quick. Ordinary families can be special because they each have a history no other family has. They all have uncle and so. They all have aunt so. They all have a brother who went off and did this adventure, and everyone has a story that no one else has. So if you know that, it makes you special. It's a fingerprint. So stories are important, and that's part of why that was one of the authors of the study. So stories are powerful. It's not knowing these specific questions that matters. You know, if you learn where your parents met, that doesn't automatically help you do better in school. It's the processes that go with it. So the process of communication, connection, and emotion, this comes with storytelling. When you tell stories, you're practicing communication, you're communicating values, you're communicating rules of your family indirectly through these stories. And you're communicating lessons. And so that communication of that information helps build healthy families and healthy individuals, and probably relates to those positive outcomes that we saw. Connection, it enhances relationships through storytelling, and research has shown this. It means that we have to honor perspectives of each person, because a story comes from multiple people and multiple perspectives. When a family can do that, that helps bring people together. And we're combining separate experiences into one. And emotion, stories elicit strong emotions, and that relates then to some of these outcomes. They found that storytelling, the right kind of storytelling, with the right kind of story, can increase empathy. This can be related to the oxytocin that stories produce in your brain, and that also creates connection. It provides perspective and context. It puts a face to an issue, so that then builds empathy in others. It gives us purpose. It's one of the best ways to communicate a larger, more transcendent purpose, which also motivates, that leads to the action part of this. And let me see, it helps create an intergenerational self in terms of purpose. I love this. We all feel stronger if we are part of a tapestry. One thread alone is weak, but woven into something larger, surrounded by other threads, is more difficult to unravel. So that's knowing that being part of a bigger family, and the broad definition of family, is healthy for people. And it inspires action. So research shows that stories have the power to change attitudes and beliefs, and that's also related to the compassion that they build, and they can result in more kindness, more generosity, more cooperation. And so this is where we see the connection between family stories and being a family diplomat, that it's healthy to tell stories as a family and to create those stories, but then it extends beyond our family. All of these things can happen if we're making policy change or social change. Stories are a huge part of that. There's different types of stories. I'm not going to tell you because now I have to go. But the best type is an oscillating story.
You should, Bethany. I think it's worth explaining these three.
Okay, I'll go fast.
Take your time.
So, ascending family narrative, that's the story like, we came to this country, we had nothing. Our family worked, we opened a store, we went to college, and now we have you and all these good things. Okay, so that's the ascending family narrative. And I drew these pictures because I think that kind of just summarizes what they are. Descending family narrative, we used to have it all, then we lost everything. And the healthiest kind of story or family narrative is this oscillating family narrative, which recognizes we've had our ups and our downs, but we get through it. And again, this is because we're learning about resilience. We're learning that it's somewhat normal to have hard things, but we've seen other people who get through them, or your great-great-grandmother got through them, and that helps build so many healthy features in children and in families as a bigger whole, but also probably beyond our families, which kind of touches on the fact that the types of stories that you tell matter. So what can you do? You've already started this. Write and record your stories. Any stories. It can be something that happened yesterday. It can be generations ago, but write them down and record them. And so keep doing that. You've done it, but don't just stop with your one story that you're doing for this program. Just talk about family history. Talk about those stories. Write a family mission statement. What are your values? That often comes through stories. Eat meals together. It's really just a way to make sure we're spending time together and talking. Have fun. When we're goofy, we're sharing and we're talking and making stories. again, we saw that so many of these times that we're sharing stories, really, people said weddings. A lot of this comes down through traditions and customs and milestones. And let me see. Yes, I will share this PowerPoint since I'm like racing through it. Collect memorabilia, take photos, write about it. That's the part sometimes we forget. Those photos lose their meaning sometimes if we don't write about it. And then be intentional. We need to think about the kinds of stories that we're telling. So just like everything else in family, storytelling can be healthy and positive and uplifting, or it can be harmful. Stories could be used potentially to manipulate or to control or to communicate values that are not healthy for a family. So we need to be careful about the stories we have. And it's not so much about the experience that we're telling the story of, it's the meaning we give the experience. We can tell stories that are hard and difficult, but the meaning we then give that is what's impactful. I'm trying to decide, this is a really long quote. I'll give you part of it really quick. We need to look at our own responsibility for the well-being of others and cultivate awareness of the impact our own stories of our own power over the body of other people. So again, it's just saying we need to be careful about the stories that we tell and be intentional about them being positive. Positive in a way of the broad meaning and the goals of it. An interesting thing is that the oxytocin that's developed when you tell an emotional story can have two effects. It can bring people together, but it can also divide people. It can give us some more us versus them mentality. So we need to be cautious about when we elicit those emotions, are we trying to bring people together? And again, just to summarize, they say stories bring us together, but they can also tear us apart. They can bring us joy, but they can also incite hatred. We're all born with the power to tell stories. It's a power we need to learn to use well and wisely, which I think is why we're here today. And you're going to get more of that information on exactly how to tell those stories coming up right now. But I just hope you remember that they're healthy for you individually, the stories you tell yourselves, the stories you tell your family, and then the stories we tell outside of that can be very impactful. Thank you.
Awesome, Bethany. Just to reiterate, we will we video record all of these meetings. They will be up at our YouTube channel, so you guys will be able to see that whenever you want. And then the PowerPoints will be shared with you as well, particularly our storytellers, but everybody else who's in the Zoom chat. Yeah, so you'll get all of it. So we have Ben and Lisette next. And just
Hi,
so you know,
everyone.
they're going to be giving you kind of a sense of like, okay, they're getting you involved in the nuts and bolts of storytelling. So go ahead, Lisa.
Yeah, we have some exercises, so everybody get ready. I know, Ben, thank you for screen sharing here.
That's us. So I know you haven't met us before, so we're going to introduce ourselves, and the way we're going to go through this part of the workshop is we're going to be switching off depending on the slide. So and there'll be some things where you participate in, and there will be a Q&A at the end for everything. So I am, my name is Ben Yavitz. I live in Washington, DC. I am on the board of advisors with Learning Life. So I've been there from the beginning since the board started. I am originally an educator. I started as a public school teacher, but now I started my own small consulting firm where I work with companies to help them on their messaging and their design of presentations to really create an impact on their audience.
Thanks, Ben. Hi, everyone. My name is Lisette Alvarez. It's really wonderful to meet you all and to be here. I'm also based in the Washington, D.C. area, but I am, as it looks like many of you, a cross-cultural, multicultural, or at least, interested in cross-cultural communications person. I grew up in many places in my formative years. I was born in the U.S. I am a U.S. citizen, but I've lived in Italy, Bolivia, and Argentina, and I have traveled across continents. There's plenty of places I still want to visit, but that definitely fostered a love of stories and storytelling and other cultures and other ways of looking at the world. So I've always been a storyteller. I call it's my vocation, it's my calling. Everything that I do, whether it's actual storytelling or not, has and comes from my love of telling stories and listening to stories. So my professional life was partially influenced by this, wide-ranging travel. I was an international communications professional, largely in the digital world, for about 7 years. And last year, I started a company called Stormfire Productions, because the past few years I've actually, it started as a hobby and I decided to do this full time, which is to do podcasting, specifically fiction podcasting. So fiction podcasts are, if you have not seen or heard of them, it's like the old style radio drama. I know in a lot of other countries, radio drama is a much bigger phenomenon. I'm hopefully part of the revival here in the United States. So really for me, storytelling is personal and professional. So, and I think that's what we're going to talk about next.
Yep. All right. So why is storytelling important? And I'm sure everybody has an idea of why they think storytelling is important. And Sept and I come from, we have our own views of that, and we also kind of tell our own storytelling in different ways with our professions. And I think that there's a distinction, but as Bethany touched on, there's always storytelling, certainly in what many of you named, from times of joy like weddings, just meeting up with friends, reunions, to in death. But then there's also the piece that's going to be really helpful professionally. So we're always telling stories, no matter what. When you go through a job interview, you're telling a story. If you're in any type of business meeting, if you're giving a speech, you're meeting with a client. So all the things you're going to be learning today are going to be helpful in all of those situations. So you can think, again, it's always good to be able to tell a story, even if you're hanging out with friends. But when you're actually engaged in any type of professional life, being able to understand just what makes up a good story is going to be really key. Lisa, do you have anything to add to that? Or?
No, just, I want to reemphasize what both Bethany and Ben has said, which is storytelling. We are storytelling animals. There's actually a book called The Storytelling Animal that is about why we tell stories. I personally really love it. I can't remember the author off the top of my head, but The Storytelling Animal is a really good book to better understand how we tell stories. We literally tell stories 24/7. We tell stories to ourselves in our dreams. So we are truly storytelling animals. And this is not, just a personal thing, but it's a professional skill. And hopefully these exercises in this presentation will help you develop storytelling as a skill and a craft for yourself. Okay. So how to select a good story. So and this is where we're going to get a little bit more on, the craft side. So, there's the touchy-feely good sense of what a good story is. We feel like it's not really defined. Everybody has a different definition of what a good story is. However, I think we can take some time to really think critically about what actually makes a good story, and which stories, when you're thinking through the stories that you're planning to tell, how you can select and how you can make it so that it actually has an impact. So the first thing to ask yourself is, what is a good hook? What actually gets people to listen? What's the answer to when you come up to somebody and you are in a position to tell your story? What is it that's going to answer that question from that person or audience of, why should I listen to this story that you're about to tell? Why should I pay attention? That is what creates a good hook. You need to ask yourself that question, and you need to answer it, and usually a pretty clear, simple and clear way. So in the entertainment industry, they usually call this a log line. They call it a hook, but a good way to put it is called a log line. And I'll give an example. The American film Wizard of Oz has a pretty clear log line. A young girl is whisked away from her home to a fantastical world and has to find her way back home. So one sentence, very clear. A lot of stuff, other things happen in the movie. There are a lot of big themes and messages and lessons that come. But when you focus on the hook, the actual heart and core of the story, when you make it that simple and that clear, just a single sentence, and I'll break down what that sentence is in a second. When you actually have a single sentence that can describe your story, you know you have a good hook. That is really what kind of it boils down to. So when you're looking at your stories that you're hoping to present, if you're able to boil it down to one sentence, you know you have a good story to tell. So how do you create this? So it's really simple. You have three elements. You have a main character or characters. You have their goal, their motivation, and you have their challenge or conflict to achieve that goal. So for Wizard of Oz, we know that the main character is a young girl. We know that her goal is to find her way back home. And the challenge or conflict is that she's been whisked away to a fantastical world. Their challenge is to find her way back. So that is a log line. That's kind of how you create a good hook. Storytelling is, in a way, truth telling. It's with a twist. You're lying. In order to tell the truth, you're telling a lie. And in some ways, in this, you can store this away as an esoteric way to understand storytelling and hooks, is that you're trying to trick your audience to thinking the story is not about them. And I'll follow that up in a minute. One of the other ways to better curate or focus your story and your storytelling is to look at other sources, other stories. I find that it's really helpful, especially as someone who's studied, cultures and stories across the world. There are many different structures and sources that you can use that can be cross-cultural, or it can be rooted in your own culture. So these are things like archetypes, fairy tales, folk tales. I actually want to, if you don't know what an archetype is, it's basically people can call it a stereotype, but it's a big type. It's a type of character that exists in many, many different stories. For example, the wise man or the wise woman, the healer, the warrior. It's usually a kind of role that exists in many different types of stories. In the chat, I don't know if anybody wants to bring up any archetypes that they know from the stories that they've heard, or stories that or the types of archetypes or folk tales or fairy tales that they really love. Feel free to kind of list them in the chat, because I think those are really helpful to ground your story in a way that actually makes it more accessible to other people. There's other ways too to ground your sources. There's something called the 7 basic plots, and it usually revolves around conflict. So it's person versus nature, person versus technology, person versus person, person versus government or system of power. So if you look up 7 basic plots, it's also a way for you to kind of, again, narrow down, make it really simple and clear what your story is about. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about the E button. The E button is emotion. When we talk about emotion in stories, it is really something that it's the reason why we tell stories. We want to conjure emotion, conjure memories. Emotion is rooted in our memories often. And you can push that button in yourself and others using your own memories to create this story means that you're going to be bringing up emotion, right? And it does mean that you're going to have to really focus on both thinking outside yourself and really understanding yourself and what story you're trying to tell, what emotions that you felt in that time, what emotions came up for others. You're going to have to also understand and from a point of view of a storyteller, you're going to have to kind of take yourself out of your own story a little bit so you can actually curate it and focus it better. So when you think about creating your story and the emotions that come up, try to also think of ways of how will this emotion or this situation that has emotional connotation, how is it going to affect my audience? What do I want it to do to my audience, to the person I'm telling? And be really empathetic to yourself and really thoughtful about what emotions you are trying to focus, what buttons you're trying to push. And that's going to really help you select your story and the beats of your story as well. And finally, I kind of want to just talk about the reason why we also want to use the E button. When you're telling a story, the very fact of storytelling is kind of a vulnerable moment, especially if it's a personal story. When you choose a story that raises emotions, I challenge you to not be afraid. Be audacious in your truth telling. Be, committed to telling the truth through this, twist of a story, because that way you really are going to find the hook in the heart. I think it really does matter that you care enough about your story, and you show that you care about your story, that it's not just a random story that you have no real connection to, because your audience is going to see that. Other people are going to see that. And the point to storytelling is that the message and the lesson is not just for you. You're trying to share it with others. So be audacious and have the audacity to speak and to tell your truth. I'm going to look real quick at the chat real quick. I know see if there was any questions, but storytelling animals because we seek to give meaning to our lives as much as we seek other fundamental needs. Yeah, no, storytelling animals because we really are. That is a really huge, it's a huge cycle. We're always like this fundamental need, and we talk about storytelling as this esoteric thing, but it does fit a need. Oh, I love Anansi stories. I have multiple books of Anansi stories. I find those stories, both the Ghanaian Anansi stories and the ones that came over to the US. Those are also really good folktales. I highly recommend. And especially Jamaican Anansi stories are really good. The E button. There's a story about the emotion. Yeah, find your hook, the hook and heart. That's right. Is there any level in the E button? Yes, absolutely. And that's actually something we're going to talk about a little bit later about we're about to go into. It's a perfect transition. We are going to talk a little bit more about the arcs and the rising and falling action. So I'll hand it back over to Ben.
All right. All right, so we're going to look at the story structure. So in any story, talking about getting your emotions going, there is a rise where you're getting to know the story, and then it rises, something happens, and then something falls. So we're going to go through those steps. So the first part we're talking about is the introduction. So Lisa, as she put it, a warm invitation. So you're getting to know some things. So as we go through this, I'm going to show you the different parts and actually questions you should answer that are going to make up your story. So the first one, which we've talked about, is the hook. Why should I listen to this story? If you think about anybody who's told a story, when you're reading a story or you're watching a movie, anytime you're hearing a story or watching a story, there's something in the beginning where you're like, I want to learn more. And that's the hook. Because I know I've picked up a book or I've started a movie where I get in 10 minutes, even 15 minutes, and I'm like, I'm bored, and I put it down. And I'm sure everybody's had those books or those movies where that's movies or shows where they didn't want to finish because they didn't get hooked in. So that's the first thing. Why should I listen to this story? And that's what you need to think about when you're telling it. Why should people listen to your story? Next part, the context. So after you give people the hook, you want to say where and when did it take place? So people need some background information, as well as who is the main character and what did they want. So you're getting to know some people in the story, because if you don't tell those in the beginning, people might get a little confused about what you're talking about. And we've heard people tell stories where we know exactly what they're talking about right away. And I've definitely walked away from shows or just someone telling me a story, and I'm like, I don't really know what that was about, because they didn't give me enough context for me to understand. So think about those times when you've heard really excellent stories, no matter the length, and other times where you kind of walked away confused. The next section we call rising action, embody the conflict. So really, what's going on? Why should we get excited about this story? You know, because of the action. And that first thing that comes up is the challenge. What was the problem or opportunity they ran into? So what's going on? So there's your main character or characters. There's something going on that's going to pose a challenge. So we need to share that. Then the next step, of course, if there's a challenge, what did they do about it? What's the conflict? The conflict can be an argument. It can be a battle. People will go missing. When you think about a story, you have to, the reason you're caring about the story, you know, beyond the hook and the context is, well, there's a problem in that story that needs to be solved. And when we see those in their stories and we feel those, you know, we either can relate to them or you just think it's a really good story. It's because you're looking at that conflict and trying to see what's going to happen. How are they going to figure this out? Because you're excited about it. And a lot of these conflicts also will bring out different emotions depending on how you relate to it. So that's an important piece of that conflict. And that's why you may be attracted to certain stories more than others, because of how you relate to those stories. Just looking back, you know, someone said, what is commonly the answer to the question, why should people listen to my story? And that, you know, that's really going to depend on it. Sometimes people are telling a good story, but maybe you have a good lesson. A lot of times there are going to, and we're going to talk about it in a minute, but there's going to be lots of reasons someone can listen to your story, but sometimes not everybody wants to listen to every story, and that is also going to be okay as well.
Yeah, just to jump in
So that's
there,
important.
I think one of the biggest, the answer to that question of why should people listen to my story is actually another question is, who are you telling this story to? Do you know knowing the people that you're sharing it with is going to answer this question and allow you to select. So that's why the previous slide was not how to create a good hook entirely. It's how to select a story. And you have to select the story where the hook will connect with the people. So that's one of the reasons why you want to step outside your story a little bit and why you care about it, and ask yourself, what would other people care about it? Why would they listen to my story?
Oh, that's perfect. Yes, exactly. Thank you. The next part, then our third part of the story is that falling action, go big or go home. What's going to happen? How are we going to resolve this? So we talk about the resolution, and often the resolution happens very quickly because you're building up this conflict. You're going up this hill, as you see, and then all of a sudden we find some resolution. So how did it turn out in the end? So that's your heart's racing. What's going to happen? And then bam, something happens. And you know that when you have that resolution in that story that you're watching, you're like, you might feel a relief, or there's sadness, or there's joy, there's something happens big in that story. And when you think about like the movie blockbusters that really get your emotions going. And I will note as we go through this that obviously there are some stories that have ups and downs along the way. So obviously a short story, some short stories may go through this exactly, but even in a short story, there can be ups and downs. But obviously when you're reading, you know, a book and you're watching a movie, this hill is gonna go up and down. Maybe there's a big resolution at the end, but there's still gonna be multiple challenges, conflicts, multiple resolutions. So it doesn't mean everything is just is gonna be this straightforward. But know that when you're telling a story, you are going to have to go through all of these, even if some of them repeat. So then from there, often you will see, of course, a good story may have a lesson. And also, you know, you think about, you know, as some of the things that were mentioned earlier, like when we have all the fables we have from different cultures, always usually have like an important lesson at the end. We often tell, you know, people often tell stories and say, hey, this is the lesson that I learned from this for themselves, and then it may relate to you. If it, as we said, if it's the right audience, certainly it may relate directly to you. So what did you learn from it? And people may find more value in your story if there is a lesson, especially if it's something they can learn. And then the last part, action. What do you think I should do now? So maybe at this point there's a lesson. You may think, the character may think, how will I do something different in the future? And so if you're telling a personal story where you actually learned a lesson, this may lead you to say, and then in the future, this is what I did, or actually something happened in the future, and because I learned something from my story, I was able to act in a different way. So as you can see, these are you've got your three main parts, and when you're telling your story, you're going to have to touch on all of these parts and these. So that's a good way to look at it. When you look at your story, hey, did I answer all of these questions?
There is a really good question of like, can the lesson be included in the hook? And I think this is really a fine tune, because when you think of your story and you as a storyteller already know the ending, right? But the person you're telling it to does not. So you don't want to necessarily spoil the ending. And it might very well be that the hook is, this character wanted this goal. Like, this character wanted to become king, but his brother is the king instead. So, is the question that he kills his brother. It's the whole story that tells you what the lesson is, because the lesson might very well be that sometimes your goal is not actually your true desire, right? There's many different ways. But you have to make the difference between the hook and the lesson. The lesson is something that you don't necessarily want to have in the hook, right? But it is something that makes it a good story.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and I'm changing one order of a slide here, so I'm going to skip ahead just because I think that will make a little more sense, and we're going to come back to that. So in this format here, we have some kind of questions, and you'll get these slides at the end, so a lot of this you'll be able to actually use as a resource. And this will be something that you'll be able to go through that'll help you out a bit. And this is something that was, of course, we mentioned, this is unspoken, objective and main message. So we talked about who is your audience. When you're telling a story to a 5-year-old, for instance, just looking at ages, you may tell it in a different way than you're going to say it to an adult. And even if it's the exact same story, you're going to have to tell that story in a different way that 5-year-old may understand than as opposed to an adult. So that's a simple, that's a simple audience. But again, you have certain stories that are going to hit people in different ways. So those are going to be important. What you want to think is like, what do you want your audience to think and feel from hearing your story? And that's important. So this is the idea here, is this is kind of a helpful thing of how you can think about your story. So as you said, transition, what should I listen to the story? I thought of a time, I'll tell you a short story along the lines of something that happened when I was very little, just to give you an idea. So transition and hook. So I remember when I was very young and my 3-year-old brother went missing, and that's my hook to my story. And I can tell you, I was living in St. Louis, Missouri, and with my mom and dad and little brother. And I was just 8 at the time. And like I said, my brother was 3. Sorry, zooming ahead. And so at that time, I was playing in my backyard. I was playing with my basketball. And my mom came outside and was looking for my brother because she couldn't find him. And I said he wasn't out there with me. So at that point, my mom was like, oh my gosh, Daniel, your brother is missing. So here we have our challenge you're going through. And so now we have conflict. What are we going to do? So my dad and mom are going through everywhere in my house, and they can't find my brother. We looked in the yard, can't find my brother. I went up and down multiple blocks walking with my dad, just calling out for my brother. And again, he's only 3. Going back and forth. We couldn't find him. This is strange. He's missing. And finally we get back to the house, and my mom is so upset. My dad is upset, and I don't know what to do. And my mom finally calls the police, because we can't have a 3-year-old roaming around in a city. We don't know where he is. And I hear my mom just giving giving that information to the police officer. She's so upset. She doesn't know what's going on. She can't find him. I mean, he's calling out his name. He's not answering. And at that point, I don't know what to do. I'm 8 years old. So then I just start, walking to the backyard. There's an area between my house and my neighbors, a pathway to the backyard. And I start walking to my backyard because I'm just going to go to the backyard and start playing again. But as I'm walking through the path, I hear a little bit of laughter. And then I walk a few more steps and I hear a little bit more of laughter. And then I see little tiny toes poking out from under the barbecue cover. And that's in the pathway. And so here we have a resolution. And I'm like, oh my gosh, my brother is hiding under the cover that's covering our barbecue pit. And he just thought it was funny because he's a 3-year-old, thought he was playing hide and seek. It didn't tell anybody. And so that's why he wasn't answering. So here we have all of a sudden, all this buildup, of conflict. And then we have this sudden resolution because I find my brother who was just hiding. So how did it turn out? When we go into that, and eventually that is what happened. Eventually I found my brother. And of course, my parents were overjoyed and could not believe he was there all along. So kind of when I think about what lesson I learned as I'm going through this story, well, we learned that, at least at this age, my brother won't necessarily call when we're calling to him, because he is, in his 3-year-old mind, he thinks he's playing a game. So he did something that we did not think he would do. So sometimes we need to look in places where he may be, even though he may not answer. So just kind of don't look in places I always think someone will be. And then, recommended action, and that kind of feeds into the recommended action. What do you think I should do? So if things happened again next time, we learned if he's hiding, we realize, oh, he's probably hasn't run away or something. He's not walking randomly. He's probably playing a game. So that's just a really short story. And so when you're going through these stories, you can kind of go through these steps. And obviously things don't have to be said just as you see them here, but it's important to go through each of these and think, okay, does my story cover all of these things? All right, we're gonna take a step back for a second. And again, just so you know, we will have question and answer at the end. So if there's something that does not get answered, we will, we'll answer it, but I will answer it. Someone says, how many minutes should a good story last? So honestly, obviously for the stories you'll be telling, I know you have up to 5 minutes, but someone can tell an amazing 1-minute story. It can just be a tiny short story because that's all that matters. And I think about, going back professionally, there are people who are pitching their ideas to companies, and people, if anybody's heard of an elevator pitch before, that's when someone is pitching a story and they're trying to sell their idea. And the idea is like, oh, they may only have 1 minute to tell the most amazing story so that someone may want to come back to them and talk to them. So they need to condense something down to a minute. But then obviously if you're reading a book or you're watching a movie, or they have more time. So really there's not a time. It really just depends on what you're telling, what your story needs. So we're going to go back, and thank you, Paul. You said you had me at the starting hook. My brother disappeared. And that's the idea. It can be just something really simple. So we're going to look at this story. This is our first small exercise. I'm going to be asking for a volunteer. So this is a story we're going to look at. And this story comes from a website where it took 2 minutes to read. And this story is told by Sabor Saheli and his daughter Jessica. And I would like someone to actually just read this story. So is there anybody who could volunteer to read the story? And I know people are on different screens sizes. So if someone can take a quick read.
I can read.
Okay, go ahead. Thank you.
Okay. I vividly remember there was a lot of happiness and joy in Eastern Afghanistan. If there was a wedding, the entire village would show up, and you felt very welcome to go into each other's homes. And we knew who had what for dinner every night, and if we didn't like what we had for dinner, we all went to the neighbor's house. I'm sorry for that. The summers are very, very hot. Everyone slept on the rooftop. And I vividly remember this old lady next door to us that would talk every night about her grandson, a student in the United States. That's when I heard the name of a country called America. I kept thinking, I'm gonna figure out a way to get to this faraway magic land someday. Then Afghanistan basically plunged into a long civil war. And my father wanted me to leave the country because he knew that things are gonna get worse. Should I read the next?
Oh yeah, so the daughter says, what did you do for work here? And continue.
One Sunday, I came to this restaurant. I walk in there and the dishwasher hadn't show up, and the manager asked me, when can I start? And I said right away. I did that for a few months, and he moved me on as I became a cook and then assistant manager. After that, we opened the restaurant, and we have treated every single customer as if they were our part of our family. We have many regulars that eat 3 meals a day in a restaurant. And if they don't show up, we call them to make sure they're okay. And we go to their funerals, we go to their weddings. These people put shoes on my children's feet, and they deserve the best. So we should turn around and give something back every single chance we get. My grandmother, she knew that most of the village did not have enough to eat. So whatever we had for dinner every night, she made sure that she'll have a plate full that I had to carry to different homes. So when I was in position to give something back, we thought on Thanksgiving Day, we're going to open our doors to anybody and everybody. Last year, for instance, we had over 800 people that come to the door. We are very, very lucky, and I don't take that for granted at all.
Thank you so much, Gustavo. So we're gonna look at this in a few different ways. So we're gonna go ahead and so we're gonna divide that story into two, and that story actually has 2 arcs. So as you can see, I've color coded the first part for you. So first we have the hook. Why should I listen? Why should I listen to the story? And so we have someone who's saying, this is what he remembers what's going on, and why he felt so welcome into their homes. And so you're getting an idea of like, why, telling me some interesting things about what's going on. We knew who we had what for dinner every night, and if we didn't like it, what we had for dinner, we went to a neighbor's house. So they always, it's talking about this idea of food, which, as you saw in that story, was really important to that story. So you're hooked into this food piece. In context, obviously, he's talking about this is being told first person, and this was in Eastern Afghanistan. And then again, you have more context, which you see in orange. Talking about the summers are very hot, talked about where people slept, talked about some of the area. And then you start hearing an introduction of the United States. So then the challenge is, I kept thinking, I'm going to figure out a way to get to this faraway magic land. So he wants to get to the United States. That's the challenge. And conflict. Well, he saw Afghanistan, plunged into this long civil war, and his father's wanted him to leave. So we have this conflict. But this is where this first section had. And he's telling a 2-minute story. So there's obviously parts we know in the next part of the story, he's already in America. So we know there was some resolution, but that's not his whole story. So that part gets skipped. So then we go to this page. So this section actually touches on every single one of those parts. So who can tell? So this is where we're going to have an activity here. So who can identify the hook? Where does the hook start? And you can either type it or just say it out loud. And if you want to say it out loud, you can just unmute yourself and say, where's the hook here?
Are you asking for the hook in this after the daughter asked the question, or in
this whole thing, wherever the hook, this entire thing, not after, it's a matter of this is a whole section. So
This is a little
hook's
bit of a trick question. Just a little bit of a trick question.
I think I would say where it says one Sunday I came to the restaurant, walking there and the dishwasher hadn't shown up. I think that would be the hook, maybe.
So that's the hook, I will say, actually starts here. And I know this one gets a little harder, is the daughter asking, so what did you do for work here? And you have to remember they're connected. And I see why you would say one Sunday, because that is still that interest point. But you have a hook here because it's like, why should I listen to stories? People want to know, what in this case, the daughter is kind of interviewing the dad, so what did you do for work here? And so sometimes another person brings in the hook, and a hook can be just a question. So in this case, the hook of the second part is actually the daughter asking the question.
And just as a note, it's interesting. So a hook can just be a question. So you could each start your story just with a question, and the question helps to frame the rest of your story.
Mm-hmm. And if it's and obviously you've heard people ask really interesting questions to get you interested in things, and that can be a really good way to start. So what part of this gives you the context? What do you think? And so like where and when did it take place? Who is the main character? Where does that start?
Seems like the first two paragraphs maybe are context.
I mean, definitely the first, yeah. So definitely the first paragraph. Well, you're getting, you're right. That one Sunday I came to the restaurant. That's your main context. Obviously, you have that character, and you're getting a little bit more information. But then, what was the challenge? What was that first problem or opportunity that showed up?
Well, in this case, it was an opportunity for him to stand up. So getting the dishwasher job, I guess.
Right. So you got the challenge, the dishwasher didn't show up. Right. And the manager said, can you start right away? And so there was that conflict in there, and he was able to then start. So then obviously, he's telling a story, and obviously he was able to start at a restaurant, that when someone didn't show up for work. But then what resolution, you could say this is a short story. So obviously there's a time in here between when he became assistant manager and then when he opened the restaurant. So we may have skipped over some of the struggles because he's trying to tell a short story in a condensed way. So then what would the resolution be then here? So it's like when you think about how did things turn out for the character? What things changed as a result of his initial conflict? So if you think about he just needed a job, right? Because he's in the US, he needs a job, and he walked in there. The dishwasher happened to not be there, so there's that conflict. That's that challenge, and there's the conflict, and the manager's like, okay, can you start right away? And he's like, okay. So he was able to go through that and start becoming this person who became that cook and assistant manager. And where did that lead him then?
Owning a restaurant.
Right. So that resolution. So obviously, this is a short story. He could go into the whole thing of how he was able to get to that restaurant. But exactly. So that idea is that it actually led him to open a restaurant. And this is again what happens. This is a 2-minute story. So if he had 5 minutes, maybe you could have other details in there. But in this case, yeah, that's full resolution had him open a restaurant. And he talks about what this restaurant really meant. And you remember in the beginning of the story, in the first half, he talked about how there was always a place to eat. If you couldn't have food at your own home, you could go to someone else's home. And so what lesson was learned here? Where's the lesson in this story?
Maybe where it says, you know, my grandmother.
Yeah, we're going
And-
on. So, and that's what he's referring to. He remembers how food was in Eastern, where he grew up in Afghanistan, where food is so important. And he's talking about, knowing, giving, and someone put giving and sharing. So what the lesson taken from this, giving and sharing, and he's telling that through saying, my grandmother, she knew most of the village didn't have enough to eat. So he's bringing that forward into his own life, part of his family. And so then I think the recommended action, I imagine, should be very easy here, what's left in the story. And he told this very explicitly here, recommended action. So as you can see, it says, so when I was in a position to give something back, we thought on Thanksgiving, we would open our doors to anybody and everybody. And he's talking, and he started actually donating, over to, donating food to people. So he's making sure people always have a place to eat. So he told that action right there. So he remembered the lessons from his grandmother, and now he's living that out because he can now provide something extra for people and providing for his community. So if you think about it again, when you're going through your story, it's, it's going to be said in different ways. And as it was said in, giving and sharing is like the high level of what this actually means. This is when you tell your stories, you want to kind of go through your stories and make sure they have all these parts. And we'll move on over to Lisa.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, Ben. And just because, all of, like Ben said, there are, when you're trying to either this was 2 minutes. If you really want to, if you're finding yourself like, you have a lot of detail you want to push, just make sure, again, the ability to focus your story and to there's a phrase that a lot of writers and storytellers like to use, which is to kill your darlings. Sometimes you have to, when you edit your story and you really want to focus on the hook and the heart and the important details, you might find yourself, turning back to, what are the core questions? What's the most important information and most important details that really hit that E button, that bring people forward, that really answer all these questions? And I think, when we step back a little bit too, this is all about people. It's about bringing people together and understanding people and understanding people's stories. So we're going to talk, I'm going to be very quick because we only have about 20 minutes left here. So I want to talk about character building in a very high level sense. You are all talking about real life stories. And sometimes it's kind of hard, kind of like what I said in the beginning, like truth-telling, like storytelling is truth-telling with a twist. You are going to have to step outside of your story yourself a little bit in order to tell it well. And part of that includes embodying the characters of the story. And that character might even be you, but it's still a storytelling. It's a story of you. It's not you as you are right now. So when you think about character building, you want to bring a lot of empathy, but also a lot of mindfulness to real people that you're talking about. Real people should be respected, even complicated people. And some of the best stories are about complicated people and complicated situations. So as a storyteller, ask yourself, how can I understand this character if this wasn't about me, or if this wasn't about somebody I knew? Ask yourself, when you're trying to identify really good characters and trying to add details, and it doesn't have to be full details. Some of it you don't actually have to tell. You can actually embody when you talk about them. Ask yourself, who are the great storytellers in your family, even if it is you? What makes them good storytellers? Is it the way that they move? Is it do they have quirks? Do they have a crazy laugh? All those types of things is really good details to actually bring to life when you're talking about the characters in your story. You need to understand why. Why did they do this way? And even if you don't add it in your story, you should know. You should have the answer to that story of why they do the things that they do. And if you don't know, then you're going to have to fill in that gap somehow. Or ask yourself, is this something that I should probably ask them before I finish telling this story? Well, that's why even with this type of storytelling exercise that you or project that you are all doing, you should consider interviewing other people, the people that are a part of this story, to get their insight and their perspective. And maybe even, and I know this is a part of the exercise of asking them to be a part of telling the story is a really good example. So when you're thinking about character building, and this is part of setting the mood, is actually understanding the people. And these are a couple of ways and a couple of questions that you should be asking yourself in order to develop it. And again, you can even ask this of yourself, of who you were in the past in this story. So we're going to now go through a series of exercises to round this out of how to embody this story that you want to tell, and ways in which you can do that. All right, so I think the next section, Ben, we want to go to.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so body and space, and I'll just say, is it good? Someone just asked, is it good to introduce fun in the storytelling? Absolutely. Storytelling should be fun, but again, it depends on what your story is about. So if you're telling a really sad story, it's not supposed to be fun. But if you're telling a story that has fun in it, then absolutely. So again,
sometimes you can have both. Sometimes you can have both. So there's an old adage of like comedy is just tragedy plus time. So you can tell us sometimes the absurd in a tragedy is a way to push that E button to make people more invested in your story. But that's a whole other lesson that's a whole other tactic you can use.
So body and space. So when you're telling a story, you need to think about your physical space. That's just all around you. And that's not, I'm currently in my guest room, which also doubles as my office. So what's around me, where I want to be placed. You have your body, what I'm doing actually with my body. And we're going to go through a couple examples of that. And then we're going to talk about people and props. So we already talked about you can interview people, or you can bring props. For instance, like as an example, when I told my story here, I could say, hey, this is my brother. He's not 3 here. He's in high school, but I can say, this is me and my brother from 20 years ago, and being able to like pull up a picture so people have some context of who you are. But so first of all, physical space, when you're telling a story, think about what's around you. So you might, what do I want in the background? Do I want things in the background that are related to my story? Do I need to clean some things off? Like there's some things I was like, I don't want certain things on camera, that's fine. Or I had clothing on the bed, I was like, I want that off. But it may not matter. And that's okay, because we're all working at home. But just being aware of what is in your space. And that's important. And that's also good, because think about if you were doing an interview when you might want to put your camera so you only have a white wall in the background, because you're trying to have this very professional space and you're trying to get, show yourself in a certain light. So it's really important. Whereas if you're in a more casual space, it may not matter what's in back of you. And so you have to decide that, but it's important for you to think about that. Body, what can you do with your body? So think about it. So you have your general distance of how far away you are specifically from a camera, because so many times we're on Zoom. So if you're going to be telling your story, you are going to be on Zoom as well. We're not doing this all in person because we're from around the world. So do I want to tell my story here? Or think about it, if I put my face so close to the camera, how does that make you feel? But maybe that's going to be important for the story if it gets really intense. But what if I go all the way back here on my chair and wheels and I want to stand up and I want to be animated, trying to describe something? Like, think about what you're doing with your hands. And a wheel back up here. So it's important to think about that, because I know I naturally talk with my hands. And sometimes I actually have to remind myself that I'm so close, you can't see what I'm doing. And I'm like, wait, I got to look in the camera, are my hands showing? And other people don't talk with their hands at all. So you really have to be aware of that. And then, because that might be important to you and it may not be. So think about what you're doing with your body and how you can use your body when you do tell your story. How is that going to help you? And then when you get into people and props, again, prop can be a photograph. It can be an important item that you're talking about in the story to help move it along. And then, of course, you can also add a person. It can be a simple person who's just giving an interview, or you want them to tell part of the story, and that's up to you. You can bring a family member in, but these are things you should be thinking about. And I think, as Paul notes, part of your space, avoiding distracting noises. If you can, when you're at home, obviously, there's a lot of things that can happen. You don't always have control. It's like you have a dog that starts barking. And then, as Paul mentioned, because if I'm moving around, you're going to pay attention to me in a different way than if I was just kind of still. So movement really has an impact, and you want to think about how you look. One of the things you can do for this is to practice. So when you're practicing your story, it's not just about listening to your story, it's about looking at yourself. So you could pull up your webcam, and actually, if you're telling your story over Zoom, tell your story and look at yourself as you tell your story. So I'm motioning with my hands for emphasis, and I just looked at my camera and I realized you can't see my hands. So I need to raise them taller or change my camera angle, and that's something to pay attention to.
One thing to interject based on Bethany's comment, I'm reminded of Chirunim, who's I think with us from Nigeria. He's actually telling a story that somebody else related to him. I don't know, Chirunim, if you're with us, but I think you are. But in any case, one idea going on what Bethany stated is that you at some point bring that person into your story. So you could actually surprise everybody by actually bringing that person into your story at some point when it makes sense in your story. So really, I was so struck by Ben when he came up to, he moved his face up. I was more interested in his face. I was more interested in what he was saying, in part because his voice quality changed. And then when he stepped back, so you're literally kind of can activate people's interest based upon what you're doing and who you're introducing. So both your body and your composition of your space and the people or the props engaged in it.
And we have a quick question. Yas?
Yeah, it's Yas. Thank you so much for the presentation. It's been really amazing. I have one question, which I usually get a lot of comments because I use my hands too. So sometimes they're attributed as a bad thing, oh my gosh, when you're talking, you shouldn't be using your hands. Or other times it's complimented that I use my hands. So I don't know, is there a specific thing for hand gestures or body when we're telling the story, when we're speaking?
I have a good answer to this, because this is, as someone who's also from a culture where I use a lot of my hands, part of it actually goes back to what Ben said about your physical space. I noticed that when you were just using your hands, your camera shook. So it seems that, I'm guessing your laptop's on your lap. It has so one way to make sure that you can tell a story with your hands without making it too distracting, or I think it's actually important to use your hands. As someone who's also been in theater, I think using your body is a good way to get people interested. But just try to make sure that the physical space, if you can put it somewhere stable so you can use your hands more. And also this goes back to actually the next bit, which will be on delivery. And I want to make a time check for us, but I think this is a good hop off, is actually your delivery and the idea of preparation and practice. So you can actually maybe even tell your story to yourself just with the camera setup, and make note of how you're using your gestures. And maybe you want to be more thoughtful about when you use it for emphasis. So this is something, again, being slowing down and being thoughtful when you're preparing your story. You can actually practice so that the gesture itself is more impactful, right? And so it doesn't mean that you don't have to use gestures at all. It's actually, you can ask yourself, when is this gesture really effective? And you can still you know, as someone who I've knocked things off tables by accident because I'm talking with my hands. I'm sure many of us have been there, but it is still helpful. This part of good storytelling is practicing, is understanding the craft of it and asking yourself questions of, is this working? Is this a good tactic to use? And being authentic, like I said, be audacious. Don't be afraid to go big. Don't be afraid to do that, because I think storytelling is about voice, is about giving voice to stories and giving voice to the voiceless, to voicing truths. So don't be afraid of, you know, your cultural background and how people culturally move, how people culturally tell stories. The structure of stories aren't just this 3-act structure either. From what comes from from the Western tradition, you can also think about story structures from your own cultures too, and usually those are found in folk tales and fairy tales of your own, and films in your own cultures. But if you have a groundedness, you'll feel more confident. And this slide is about bringing confidence to your delivery and your voice. So I am a podcaster. I'm most interested in voice and oral storytelling. So I'm going to, I see that Tennille, or is it, did I say that right?
Yeah, I could wait till you finish and I can ask
okay.
my question after. Yeah.
You can also put it in the chat if you need to. That'll be easy for us to then.
Fine.
Yes. Oh, fair enough. Okay, so preparation. Very quickly, the biggest thing here is preparation allows for, especially, I know this lesson is in English, right? And a lot of you are asking your questions and writing your questions in English, even if it's not your first language. If you are planning to tell your story in English, one of the things is about this preparation and this confidence building is actually to help you. It helps everyone, whatever language is your native language and whatever language you're telling your story in. It's really important to still prepare because it gives you that confidence. So when you're off screen, or even if you're just on camera alone, here's some ways to warm up and practice. One, get silly. There's a lot of ways to prepare your voice as well as prepare your off your nerves. So an easy one is just doing this. Don't worry about being ridiculous because nobody's seeing you. You are just letting that energy so you can get prepared, get more confident, and let go of some of the, anxiety of telling and speaking in front of people. Another thing is using tongue twisters. A big black bug bit a big black bear. That helps put words in your mouth and prepare your mouth for telling a story. The other thing is, moving around, standing up, jumping around, doing a power pose. That can also help just release that and get you embodied and release some stress. The other thing too is preparing a script. When you're practicing, have a written out script and make notes on it. And I'll show you what it can look like to make notes of when to get big, when to pause, when to breathe. And that's the biggest thing I want to actually emphasize here. Breathing will help slow you down. It happens in all the time, especially when I work with actors and voice actors who are reading a script. They often read faster than they realize. So breathing helps you pause, helps you think and regroup, and it actually is completely okay from the audience perspective, and it gets them again to maybe leaning closer. What's next? Suspense. It's a helpful storytelling tool. And finally, we're going to talk about shaping your tone. It kind of makes sense when you're initially talking about a story. You want to be warm, you want to be enticing, you yourself want to kind of build the excitement when you talk about it. You want to invite people in. There's a way to shape the mood by starting out with a suspense about that kind of once upon a time feeling. That's a warm invitation. You're excited to talk to somebody else. Having that feeling for the hook is going to help start the story. And then rising action, as things get conflict, you can talk about something very quickly, and then you can pause and then talk about something else that happened. There's ways in which to shape your tone, especially when you're, when you're getting to the big point, and when you know where the big point is, you can shape your tone by obviously either getting louder, softer, harsher. There's different ways to do it. It depends on your story and how you want and what emotions you want to bring. So that is my delivery techniques there. I know we only have a couple minutes left, so I will go to the last two, or the last one. And I think Gustavo, if he's still here, you had that first warm up or that cold read. If you're willing and if you're here, can you now read this warm up exercise? And before I do that, I'm going to ask you to warm up just however you want to. You can either make that weird sound. You can just, I don't see you on camera. You can just stretch, whatever, do something physically.
And Gustavo,
Yeah.
exactly. So
yes.
now that you have a little bit of training and a sense of possibilities, deliver this as
You
best
could
you
deliver
can in
this.
the most interesting way you can.
Yeah. And just for a note, you can see that I put little notes. There's the little star is when you can breathe. The little quotation marks is somebody else's voice. It's not yours, it's somebody else's, right? And then the underline is elongate, so making it longer. And then the little triangle is to punch it up, get it punchy. If that makes sense. And you don't have to be perfect, does not matter. These are guidelines, but this is a way to edit a script edit your story so you know how to perform it.
All right. So when you say punch, what exactly do you mean?
You can be louder.
Oh.
You can be, it's almost like when you, in a word is punchy, you talk like this, it's almost like you're trying to fight with your voice, right? That's a good way to do it. And it's okay to go over the top. I'm not asking for perfection, and it can be a little bit silly the first time you do it, but this is a way to practice, right? So don't worry about, and everyone else don't create any judgment for Gustavo yet. It's a practice. Okay, whenever you're ready.
Right. One Sunday, I came to this restaurant. I walked in there and the dishwasher hadn't show up, and the manager asked me, "When can you start?" And I said, "Right away." And I said, "Right away." I did that for a few months, and he moved on as a cook and then assistant manager. After that, we opened the restaurant, and we have treated every single customer as if they were part of our family. We have many regular that eat 3 meals a day in a restaurant. And if they don't show up, we call them to make sure that they're okay. And we go to their funerals, we go to their weddings. These people put shoes on my children's feet, and they deserve the best. So we should turn around and give something back every single chance we get.
Nice.
So hopefully very well, very good, Gustavo. Thank you. But as you can hear, everybody, you hear the difference from when the first time Gustavo read this, and the emotions that came through and the pacing that came through was more natural and more interesting when you have this. And of course, you can do it however you want. But yeah, I guess, yeah, Q&A time. Right. I don't know or Ben, if you have any other final.
Nope. I just thought that was a really good example. I think that was such a good example of how, that's why we started with that cold read, and you didn't know what was going on, and just like simple direction, and it really completely changed things with a story that you just heard today, So it's something to think about when you do your own stories. We all can tell our stories, but there are certain people that are really good storytellers, and you can do that with your own. That's why it's good to look at yourself and record yourself for practice. So, because a lot of times you can't truly hear yourself until you listen to a recording.
There were a couple of questions. I'm gonna start with, there's a very quick question that was asked about, what if I'm telling my story, but my camera is off? That means you lean into the voice. I want you to paint a painting with your voice. And one way to do that is just listen to you. Find other people where you find like their voice is amazing, or like the way they tell a story just with their voice. Listen to the radio, listen to podcasts, learn from people how they make this, their voices big and crazy without any visual. That's it. And Tennille, I think, is
okay.
still holding her hand.
Thank you. So thank you so much. Like, I absolutely love the presentation. I can't wait to get the PowerPoint presentations. So my question is, I know that you were talking about the audience and us having to reach the audience and how we're doing that. But my question is, I was thinking about, for instance, like in the movie industry, there are some actors that they're good at drama, they're good at comedy. Do you think that as storytellers that have people, because they have a certain voice, it's better to tell like more sobering stories, or some people they're better for like comedy or action? I know they could do everything, but do you think that as a storyteller, there are some people that have a character that once you realize like where your safe space and what you're good at, that you could just drive that home?
Oh yeah, I think when you end up doing stories regularly, you start to find your own voice. And I think that's one of the reasons why this type of practice is so important, is that you should find your own voice. You should be able to tell stories often enough so you start to realize which stories you can just pull out of a hat that you're really, really good at, that lands really, really well. And, always, if you want to, in the entertainment industry, obviously there is casting types, right? I've been casted type plenty of times in other areas, but I think it is important to go back when we talk about the hook. What are the emotions that draw you first? You really want to ask yourself, why do I want to tell this story? Then you can also ask, then what makes this story appealing to other people, and how can I make it more appealing to other people? So I think for the purposes of this exercise, you should focus on those two things. One, what emotions you really, really want to tell a story about. And two, how do those emotions connect with, stepping outside of that, how do those connect with other people and other people's stories? And by practicing, you'll start to develop, this is a story I feel I do really, really well. And this is the type of story I do really, really well. But it really just comes down to practice.
Yeah, and
to know what that is.
It's important to note, I mean, sure, there are people who are like professionals who are cast in roles where their voice fits a certain character. And besides the fact they're professionals, but that's because the person who's in charge of telling the story, the writer, the producer, they have a certain vision. So they're looking for that person with a certain voice. Maybe they need a high-pitched voice. Maybe they need a low, booming voice when you think about different characters. But because it's your story, it's your voice. So you're the voice that matters. And that's why the activity you were just taken through, when you learn to modulate your voice to tell certain parts of the story in different ways, that's for you to decide because it's your story.
So in the interest of time, I want to kind of wrap things up. This has been really good, and really appreciate Ben, Lisette, and Bethany providing us a lot of things to consider. I think it underscores that there are a lot of possibilities for your storytelling. One thing I'm reminded of while we were going through this is that some of you, as I think Leroy asked, right, have kind of in some sense a built-in disadvantage, and it's not your fault. It's the fact that sometimes your technology is not good enough. In other words, it's the connection is not good enough that you can have both your visual, the video and the audio on at the same time. So you're going to be telling your story just audio, but use that challenge as an opportunity to think creatively about how you can make it interesting. The other thing is that I think as Lisette noted, you have to tell, one of the conditions here is you have to tell your story in English. And I'm sorry about that for those of you for whom that's not your primary language. So that is another challenge that you have to overcome. But nonetheless, we will be taking that into account, among other things. And making sure that you're not discriminated against because your first language is not English, right? So so I just want to keep those things in mind. I'm going to pass it on to Bethany, who I think has some kind of summary kind of thoughts to offer you.
I know we're running out of time, so I kind of made super many thoughts in the chat. There was a person who was trying to help people better understand and make change in teaching and supporting teachers. And he had said, if you've invited me to your story, you invited me to who you are, now I feel like I'm connected to you, and now let's build together. And so I think that's just a reminder of the importance of storytelling. And you've just learned how to help people take in your story and personalize your story and their experiences, that we can build something, which is, I think, something probably a common goal among all of us, is to building something and making sure that family voices are heard in your family diplomacy work.
Yeah, and speaking of which, I need to, I think it was Gustavo that reminded us that we haven't taken a photo yet. So I need to take a photo of everybody, if you would. If you could just briefly, for those of you who don't have your cameras on, turn on your cameras. And I will ask you, I will ask you to smile on 3. So when you are ready, please turn on your cameras if you're able to. Chanel, Justice, Mohammed, and Janice, if you're able to. 1, 2, 3, smile. Awesome. Let me take another quick shot, just in case that first one had some closed eyes and so on. On 3, 1, 2, 3, smile. Perfect. Thank you so much, everybody. So just to wrap up here, we are, for the next 3 sessions, have practice. So come to this with your stories. You're going to be asked to do practice runs. Given what you just learned today, you may want to change your story in certain ways. I'm also going to be asking you to write down your story. Write it down, because you'll need to identify what the hook is. Just as Ben and Lisette indicated to you guys, you'll need to identify the different parts of your story and how you're going to construct that. And writing it down allows you to do that construction, to figure out what are the elements of your story, what's your hook, among other things. So please go ahead and write down your stories. We'll practice over the next 3 sessions, and then you guys are giving your final performances on the 9th and the 16th of October. On those 2 Sundays, the storytellers you'll just have 1 5-minute opportunity to tell your story. We're going to encourage you to bring family members. They'll have to join, unless they're part of your story, they will have to join separately. So we encourage you to bring your family members to this. This is, after all, family storytelling. And however many friends, et cetera, and so forth, we want them to be part of your team. Ultimately, we are going to be seeing how much you've been able to improve your own story. So keep in mind, you're not really competing against each other, at least for the awards. And the awards are not a lot of money. It's $100 for the 3 best, most improved storytellers. So you're not competing against each other. We're just going to be comparing your story before and your story after the training and practice, which means you're really competing just against yourself. And we'll figure out who's most improved. So in the meantime, if you have any questions, or if you have any thoughts, if you have any thing you want to add, please do so in the Facebook chats. We have 2 Facebook chats, one just for the storytellers, where you guys can share with each other. There are 17 of you from 13 different countries. And then the other is for the larger group of people who are interested in being family diplomats. You guys are just kind of, in some sense, the vanguard. You're our first cohort of family storytellers. So it's really exciting to be working with you. Okay, before I lose my voice, thank you all. for your attendance. Thanks again to Ben, Lisette, and Bethany for their awesome presentations. By the way, Joe had asked privately, are they going to be here for the practice runs over the next 3 sessions? That's up to them. They're not expected to. I really just asked them to participate in this session, but you will have, of course, the video recordings, and our interns who are in on these sessions are here to help you out. You guys are here to help each other out, to figure out how you can tell better stories. And it's really, can you move each other? Can you move an ordinary person who's not a trained storyteller to actually tell a good story? And that's what we're going to figure out over the next 3 practice sessions. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for your time, and see you next Sunday. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Everyone.